Number 1. Donald Harvey, the angel of death who murdered dozens of hospital patients across multiple states over nearly 2 decades. Born in 1952 in Butler County, Ohio, Donald Harvey presented himself as a mild-mannered, helpful orderly who simply wanted to care for the sick and dying. Yet beneath this facade of compassion lay one of the most prolific serial killers in American medical history. A man who would ultimately confess to killing at least 37 people, though authorities believe the true number could exceed 80 victims. Harvey's killing spree began in 1970 when he was just 18 years old, working as an orderly at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky, where he would later admit to murdering his first patient using a pillow to smother an elderly man, an act he claimed was done out of mercy to end the patient's suffering. This initial killing apparently triggered something in Harvey's psyche, transforming what he described as a compassionate act into an addictive pattern of murder that would continue unchecked for 17 years as he moved between healthcare facilities in Kentucky and Ohio, always leaving behind a trail of unexplained deaths that no one thought to investigate as potential homicides. Harvey's methods evolved from simple suffocation to more sophisticated techniques including cyanide poisoning, arsenic contamination of intravenous fluids, and injections of various substances including hepatitis serum, and even pure oxygen injected directly into patients' bloodstream, methods designed to mimic natural causes and avoid detection by medical examiners who routinely signed off on death certificates without suspicion. His employment history read like a map of institutional failure, working at Marymount Hospital from 1970 to 1971, then at the Cincinnati VA Medical Hospital from 1972 to 1984, followed by a brief stint at Daniel Drake Memorial Hospital in 1985, each position ending with his resignation or dismissal for reasons unrelated to the mounting death toll among his patients. The breakthrough finally came in 1987 when medical examiner Dr. Lee Lehman performed an autopsy on 44-year-old John Powell, a comatose patient who had died suddenly at Drake Hospital where Harvey was then employed, discovering an extraordinarily high level of cyanide in Powell's tissues that could only have resulted from deliberate poisoning. Harvey was arrested on March 11, 1987, and initially denied all allegations, but faced with overwhelming forensic evidence and the prospect of multiple murder charges, he began cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for protection from the death penalty, ultimately leading authorities to dozens of victims they had never suspected were murdered. His detailed confessions revealed a chilling psychological profile of a killer who derived satisfaction from the power of life and death, who kept journals documenting his victims, and who viewed himself as an angel of death, performing a service for suffering patients even when many of his victims were not terminally ill. The legal proceedings against Harvey resulted in multiple life sentences totaling over 400 years, with Ohio prosecutors securing convictions for 24 murders in October 1987 followed by Kentucky convictions for 9 additional murders in November 1987, ensuring he would never be released from prison. Harvey died in 2017 at the age of 64, beaten to death by a fellow inmate at the Toledo Correctional Institution, an ironic end for a man who had caused so many deaths himself. The Harvey case exposed critical vulnerabilities in healthcare oversight, leading to reforms in how hospitals monitor patient deaths and track employment histories of healthcare workers. Though many experts believe similar killers may still operate undetected in healthcare settings, where vulnerable patients die regularly without suspicion. Number 2. Charles Cullen, the registered nurse who murdered at least 29 patients and possibly as many as 400 over 16 years at 9 different New Jersey and Pennsylvania hospitals, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history and exposing catastrophic failures in healthcare regulation and institutional accountability. Born in 1960 in West Orange, New Jersey, Charles Cullen's early life was marked by trauma and loss, his father dying when he was 7 months old, his mother dying in a car accident when he was 17, and his sister of 9 children dying of leukemia shortly thereafter, losses that psychologists would later analyze as potentially contributing to his psychological development and eventual criminal behavior. Cullen enlisted in the Navy in 1978 but received a medical discharge in 1984 after multiple suicide attempts and psychiatric hospitalizations, subsequently entering nursing school at Mountainside Hospital School of Nursing in Montclair, New Jersey, where he earned his nursing degree in 1986 and began what would become a deadly career spanning nearly 2 decades. His first confirmed murder occurred in June 1988 at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey, where he administered a lethal overdose of intravenous medication to 72-year-old Judge John Yengo, a patient under his care. establishing a pattern that would continue with increasing frequency as Cullen moved from hospital to hospital, always leaving before investigations could connect him to the suspicious deaths occurring on his shifts. Cullen's methods primarily involved overdosing patients with heart medications including digoxin and epinephrine, substances that when administered in excessive amounts would cause fatal cardiac events that appeared natural to attending physicians and medical examiners unfamiliar with his presence and actions. His employment history revealed a disturbing pattern of dismissal and resignation. St. Barnabas Medical Center in New Jersey from 1987 to 1988, Warren Hospital in New Jersey from 1988 to 1992, Hunterdon Medical Center in New Jersey from 1992 to 1993, Morristown Memorial Hospital in New Jersey in 1993, St. Barnabas again in 1995, Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia from 1996 to 1998, Abington Memorial Hospital in Pennsylvania from 1998 to 1999, St. Luke's Hospital in Pennsylvania from 1999 to 2002, and finally Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey from 2002 to 2003, with investigations later revealing that several of these institutions had suspected Cullen of wrongdoing yet failed to report their concerns to law enforcement or subsequent employers. The critical breakthrough occurred at Somerset Medical Center in 2003 when the hospital's pharmacist noticed unusually high orders for digoxin and epinephrine on Cullen's unit, prompting an internal investigation that discovered Cullen had accessed patient records of individuals who had subsequently died under suspicious circumstances, including several patients who were not assigned to his care. Hospital administrators, fearing liability, delayed reporting their findings to authorities for several months, during which time Cullen killed at least one additional patient, 82-year-old Reverend Florian Gall, before finally being arrested on December 12, 2003. During interrogation, Cullen initially denied all allegations but eventually confessed to murdering 13 patients at Somerset Medical Center and 16 patients at other hospitals, though he suggested the true number was far higher, possibly reaching 40 patients that he could specifically recall, with many more that had faded from memory. Prosecutors in both New Jersey and Pennsylvania negotiated a comprehensive plea agreement in which Cullen would receive 17 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole for 397 years in exchange for his full cooperation in identifying all victims and explaining his methods to help prevent similar crimes, an agreement that spared him the death penalty but ensured permanent incarceration. The Cullen case triggered massive reforms in healthcare oversight, including New Jersey's 2004 Healthcare Professional Responsibility and Reporting Enhancement Act, which mandated reporting of healthcare workers suspected of wrongdoing to state boards and law enforcement. Yet critics noted that many of the institutions where Cullen worked had failed to act even when they had clear evidence of his dangerous behavior, prioritizing institutional reputation over patient safety. Cullen remains incarcerated at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, having survived multiple suicide attempts in custody, while forensic investigators continue to examine death records at his former hospitals, believing hundreds of additional victims may never be identified due to cremation, degraded evidence, and the passage of time. Number 3. Kristen Gilbert, the Veterans Affairs nurse who murdered 4 patients and attempted to murder 3 others at a Massachusetts VA hospital, using epinephrine injections to cause fatal cardiac arrests and creating chaos on her unit to feed her desire for excitement and attention. Born Kristen Strickland in 1967 in Fall River, Massachusetts, she grew up in a troubled household marked by her father's abandonment and subsequent suicide, experiences that psychologists would later examine for connections to her eventual criminal behavior and her apparent attraction to crisis situations and medical emergencies. Gilbert married Glenn Gilbert in 1988 and began her nursing career at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, Massachusetts, in 1989. Where she initially appeared to be a competent and dedicated nurse working on the cardiac ward known as Ward C, a unit where patients with heart conditions made ideal targets for her eventual murder method involving epinephrine overdoses. Her crimes began in earnest in 1995, though retrospective analysis suggested earlier suspicious deaths, when Gilbert began injecting patients with massive doses of epinephrine, a synthetic form of adrenaline that in excessive amounts causes fatal heart rhythm disturbances, cardiac arrest, and death. Symptoms that initially appeared consistent with her patients' underlying conditions and attracted little suspicion from colleagues. Gilbert's pattern involved injecting patients during or just after her shifts, then participating in or even leading the resuscitation efforts that followed, seemingly deriving satisfaction from the chaos and heroics of emergency response, with witnesses describing her as becoming excited and animated during code blue situations in ways that seemed inappropriate to experienced medical personnel. Her behavior extended beyond murder to creating dangerous situations for attention, including making false bomb threats to the hospital and setting fires in the facility, actions that increased the atmosphere of crisis she seemed to crave while diverting attention from the mounting death toll on her unit. The first serious suspicions emerged in 1995 when nurse Amy Lucier noticed that patient deaths on Ward C seemed to cluster during Gilbert's shifts and that Gilbert appeared to predict code blue emergencies before they occurred, raising concerns with supervisors that were initially dismissed without thorough investigation. The definitive break in the case came in February 1996 when a pharmacy inventory revealed large quantities of missing epinephrine specifically from Ward C, prompting a more serious internal investigation that coincided with Gilbert's colleagues becoming increasingly vocal about their suspicions regarding her proximity to so many patient deaths. Gilbert was placed on administrative leave in February 1996 and resigned in March of that year rather than face termination, subsequently attempting suicide by overdosing on prescription medications, an act interpreted by prosecutors as consciousness of guilt rather than genuine suicidal intent given her history of attention-seeking behavior. Federal investigators took over the case given the VA hospital jurisdiction, conducting extensive forensic analysis of patient medical records and tissue samples that revealed epinephrine levels inconsistent with therapeutic administration in multiple deaths, building a circumstantial case that relied heavily on statistical analysis showing deaths on Ward C dropped by 50% after Gilbert's departure. Gilbert was indicted in January 1998 on 4 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of attempted murder, with prosecutors also investigating her in approximately 80 additional suspicious deaths, though insufficient evidence prevented additional charges. Her trial began in November 2000 in federal court in Springfield, Massachusetts, lasting 9 weeks and featuring testimony from colleagues who described her inappropriate excitement during emergencies, pharmacists who documented missing epinephrine, and forensic experts who explained the physiological effects of epinephrine overdose and analyzed tissue samples from her victims. The defense attempted to portray Gilbert as a dedicated nurse targeted by jealous colleagues and coincidence, emphasizing the lack of direct eyewitnesses to her injections and highlighting legitimate medical uses of epinephrine in cardiac care, but the statistical evidence and pattern of deaths proved overwhelming. The jury convicted Gilbert on all counts on March 14, 2001, and she was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole plus 20 years for the attempted murders, a sentence that ensures she will die in federal prison. The Gilbert case highlighted vulnerabilities in VA hospital oversight and the difficulty of detecting medical murder even when colleagues expressed concerns, leading to improved medication tracking systems and protocols for investigating clusters of unexpected deaths. Though critics noted that initial warnings were ignored for months while patients continued to die. Unlike many medical killers, Gilbert has maintained her innocence, filing multiple unsuccessful appeals alleging prosecutorial misconduct and insufficient evidence. Currently incarcerated at Federal Medical Center, Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, where she will remain for the remainder of her life. Number 4. Beverly Allitt, the British nurse who murdered 4 children and attempted to murder 9 others at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in Lincolnshire, England, becoming one of the most notorious female serial killers in British history, and the focus of intense psychological study regarding Munchausen syndrome by proxy and healthcare professionals who harm those in their care. Born in 1968 in Corby, Northamptonshire, Beverly Gale Allitt had a troubled childhood marked by frequent illnesses that were often fabricated or exaggerated, behavioral patterns that psychologists would later identify as precursors to Munchausen syndrome, a psychiatric disorder characterized by feigning illness for attention and sympathy. Allitt trained as a state-enrolled nurse at Grantham College, completing her training in 1991 and beginning employment at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital on the children's ward known as Ward 4, a position she obtained despite having been rejected by other hospitals and having a documented history of erratic behavior and unexplained injuries that should have raised concerns about her fitness for pediatric nursing. Her crime spree began on February 21, 1991, with the murder of 7-month-old Liam Taylor, who died of cardiac arrest after Allitt injected him with a massive dose of insulin, initiating a pattern of attacks on vulnerable children that would continue for nearly 2 months and claim 3 more lives while leaving numerous others with permanent disabilities. Allitt's methods included insulin injections causing fatal hypoglycemia, suffocation by various means, and the injection of air into intravenous lines causing embolisms, techniques designed to mimic natural medical complications and avoid detection in a hospital setting where critically ill children were expected to deteriorate. Her victims ranged in age from 2 months to 5 years, all children with pre-existing medical conditions that made them vulnerable and whose deaths would not immediately suggest foul play to attending physicians focused on treating underlying diseases. The pattern of suspicious collapses on Ward 4 became increasingly apparent to hospital staff, with children suffering unexpected respiratory and cardiac events specifically during Allitt's shifts, some children experiencing multiple collapse episodes that correlated precisely with her presence. The critical turning point came with 8-month-old Becky Phillips, who died on April 4, 1991, from a massive insulin injection, and her twin sister Katie, who survived a similar attack but suffered permanent brain damage, events that finally prompted senior doctors to recognize that they were witnessing intentional harm rather than medical misfortune. Consultant pediatrician Dr. Charith Nanayakara initiated a formal investigation, reviewing all Ward 4 incidents and discovering that Allitt had been present for every suspicious event, had access to all victims, and had made inconsistent statements about her actions, leading to her suspension on April 22, 1991, and subsequent police involvement. The subsequent investigation was one of the most complex in British medical history, requiring extensive forensic analysis to detect insulin and other substances in tissue samples, with experts from around the world consulted to develop techniques for identifying artificial insulin administration in deceased infants. Allitt was arrested in November 1991 and charged with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder, with the prosecution building a circumstantial case based on opportunity, pattern, and forensic evidence of insulin in victims' tissues that could only have been administered through injection. Her trial began in February 1993 at Nottingham Crown Court, lasting nearly 6 months as the prosecution presented detailed medical evidence and the defense argued that the children had died of natural causes exacerbated by medical error, with Allitt herself testifying and displaying the same attention-seeking behaviors that had characterized her nursing career. The jury convicted Allitt on all counts on May 28, 1993, and she was sentenced to 13 concurrent terms of life imprisonment, with the judge recommending she serve at least 30 years before parole consideration, a sentence later modified to a whole life tariff meaning she will never be released. Extensive psychological evaluation following conviction diagnosed Allitt with Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition in which caregivers harm dependents to gain attention and sympathy as rescuers, explaining her pattern of creating medical emergencies then participating in resuscitation efforts and her apparent lack of conventional emotional response to the suffering she caused. The Allitt case fundamentally transformed British pediatric care and hospital safety protocols, leading to the establishment of mandatory incident reporting systems, improved vetting of healthcare workers, and the creation of specialized forensic pediatric units, while also generating extensive research into Munchausen syndrome by proxy and its detection in medical settings. Allitt remains incarcerated at Rampton Secure Hospital, having been transferred from prison to a high-security psychiatric facility in 2007 following a hunger strike and deteriorating mental health, where she continues to serve her life sentence while representing a continuing subject of psychological research into female serial killers and medical murderers. Number 5. Richard Angelo, the New York nurse known as the Angel of Death, who murdered at least 25 patients and attempted to murder many more at 2 Long Island hospitals in 1987, using pancuronium bromide and other paralytic drugs to induce respiratory arrest then rescue his victims in a twisted pattern of heroism and murder that exposed critical gaps in hospital medication security. Born in 1962 in East Northport, Long Island, Richard Angelo grew up in what appeared to be a stable middle-class family, excelled academically, and pursued nursing with apparent genuine interest in patient care, graduating from the State University of New York at Farmingdale in 1986 and beginning his nursing career at Good Samaritan Hospital in West Islip, New York, where he quickly developed a reputation as an exceptionally attentive and competent nurse who frequently volunteered for extra shifts and seemed to have an unusual ability to predict patient emergencies. Angelo's murder method involved administering pancuronium bromide, a powerful paralytic agent used in anesthesia that causes complete muscle paralysis including respiratory muscles, leading to death by asphyxiation unless immediate mechanical ventilation is provided. A drug that Angelo would inject into patients' intravenous lines then rush to discover and treat, positioning himself as a heroic nurse who repeatedly saved lives through his vigilance and quick response. His first confirmed murder occurred in January 1987 at Good Samaritan Hospital, though retrospective investigation suggested earlier victims, and over the subsequent 10 months he escalated his attacks with increasing frequency, murdering at least 10 patients at Good Samaritan before transferring to Stony Brook University Hospital in September 1987, where he continued his killing spree for another 2 months before finally being caught. Angelo's pattern was remarkably consistent. He would inject a paralytic drug during his shift, often after midnight when staffing was reduced, then either discover the patient in respiratory distress himself or ensure he was present when alarms sounded, initiating resuscitation efforts that sometimes succeeded but often failed given the drug's potent effects, with each successful rescue reinforcing his self-image as a heroic nurse while each death was attributed to natural causes. The breakthrough came on October 11, 1987, at Stony Brook University Hospital when 21-year-old patient Gerolamo Kucic, admitted for minor surgery, experienced sudden respiratory arrest and survived only because his mother, Gloria Kucic, was present and immediately called for help, subsequently telling physicians that she had seen Richard Angelo inject something into her son's intravenous line just before the collapse. Hospital administrators, informed of this eyewitness account, conducted an immediate investigation discovering that Angelo had accessed pancuronium bromide without authorization and had been present at numerous suspicious patient collapses at both hospitals, leading to his suspension and arrest on October 15, 1987. During interrogation, Angelo initially denied all allegations but eventually confessed to multiple murders, providing detailed accounts of his methods and motivations that revealed a complex psychological profile combining narcissistic need for admiration with genuine confusion about the moral nature of his actions, describing himself as wanting to be a hero while acknowledging that his rescues required first creating the emergencies. The subsequent investigation required extensive toxicological analysis to identify pancuronium in tissue samples, challenging work given the drug's rapid metabolism, with forensic pathologists ultimately confirming at least 25 murders and 5 attempted murders, though Angelo suggested the true number was higher and many victims could not be tested due to cremation or degraded samples. Angelo was indicted in January 1988 on multiple counts of second-degree murder, with prosecutors initially seeking the death penalty under New York law then recently reinstated, though this was ultimately not pursued. His trial began in January 1989 at Suffolk County Court, with the prosecution presenting extensive forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, and Angelo's own detailed confessions, while the defense argued psychological factors including diminished capacity and a dissociative disorder that prevented full comprehension of his actions. The jury convicted Angelo on multiple counts of second-degree murder and attempted murder on April 25, 1989, and he was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison, effectively a life sentence given the consecutive nature of multiple convictions. The Angelo case prompted immediate reforms in hospital medication security, including computerized dispensing systems, stricter protocols for accessing controlled drugs, and mandatory witnessing of high-risk medication administration, changes that have since become standard throughout American healthcare. Angelo remains incarcerated at Green Haven Correctional Facility in Stormville, New York, having served over 35 years of his sentence with multiple unsuccessful parole applications, his case remaining a foundational study in nursing education regarding medical murder detection and prevention. Number 6. Orville Lynn Majors, the Indiana licensed practical nurse convicted of murdering 6 elderly patients but suspected of killing over 100 others at Vermilion County Hospital, whose case exposed how a single determined killer could operate for years in a small rural hospital where his victims' deaths were accepted as natural given their advanced age. Born in 1956 in Linton, Indiana, Orville Lynn Majors grew up in a working-class family and pursued nursing as a practical career choice, becoming a licensed practical nurse and eventually operating a home healthcare business with his mother, May Majors, before financial difficulties led him to seek employment at Vermilion County Hospital in Clinton, Indiana, in 1993 at the age of 37. The small 60-bed rural hospital served an aging population, with many patients suffering from chronic conditions that made them frequent admissions and, critically, made their deaths expected rather than suspicious, an environment that provided Majors with ideal conditions for undetected murder over nearly 3 years. Majors's murder method involved injecting patients with potassium chloride and epinephrine, substances that when administered in excessive amounts cause fatal cardiac events that appear natural in elderly patients with heart conditions, with the potassium chloride being particularly difficult to detect postmortem as potassium is naturally present in the body and levels fluctuate after death. His victims were overwhelmingly elderly, ranging from 65 to 93 years old, all patients on the medical surgical floor where Majors worked the night shift, with deaths occurring with remarkable frequency during his shifts and often within minutes of his entering patients' rooms for routine care. The pattern became apparent to some hospital staff as early as 1994, with nurses noticing that Majors seemed to have an unusual number of patients die on his shifts and that he would sometimes predict deaths before they occurred. Yet these concerns were initially dismissed given the patient population and the reluctance to consider that a colleague could be deliberately killing vulnerable people. The critical breakthrough came in late 1995, when the Indiana State Department of Health conducted a routine review and discovered that the hospital's death rate had increased 350% since 1993. With Majors present for 147 of 164 deaths on his unit during this period, a statistical impossibility that finally prompted serious investigation and Majors' suspension in December 1995. The subsequent investigation by Indiana State Police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation was one of the most extensive in state history, involving exhumation of numerous bodies for toxicological analysis, review of hundreds of medical records, and extensive interviews with hospital staff and families of deceased patients. Investigators identified at least 130 suspicious deaths potentially linked to Majors, though evidentiary limitations allowed prosecution on only 6 counts of first-degree murder and 6 counts of attempted murder, with the selected cases representing those with the strongest forensic evidence including detectable levels of unauthorized medications in preserved tissue samples. Majors was arrested in December 1997 and pleaded not guilty to all charges, with his defense team arguing that the deaths were natural consequences of advanced age and chronic illness, that the statistical analysis was flawed, and that no direct evidence linked him to any specific injection, while prosecutors built a circumstantial case based on pattern, opportunity, and forensic evidence of unnatural medication levels in his victims. His trial began in October 1999 at Clay County Circuit Court, lasting nearly 3 months as the prosecution presented extensive statistical analysis, toxicological evidence, and testimony from hospital staff regarding Majors' unusual behavior and proximity to deaths, while the defense emphasized the absence of eyewitnesses and the natural fragility of the elderly patient population. The jury convicted Majors on 6 counts of first-degree murder on October 17, 1999, after deliberating less than 4 hours, and he was subsequently sentenced to 360 years in prison, effectively a life sentence that ensures he will never be released regardless of appeals or parole considerations. The Majors case highlighted critical failures in rural hospital oversight, where limited resources and aging patient populations create conditions conducive to undetected medical murder, leading to improved death review protocols and statistical monitoring systems that can identify unusual mortality patterns before they reach the scale of the Vermilion County Hospital tragedy. Majors remains incarcerated at Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, having exhausted all direct appeals and maintained his innocence throughout, with advocates continuing to campaign for review of additional deaths that were never prosecuted, believing the true victim count far exceeds the 6 convictions and may represent one of the highest medical murder tolls in American history. Number 7. Robert Diaz, the California registered nurse who murdered 12 elderly patients in 1981 at Community Hospital of the Valleys in Paris, California, using massive overdoses of lignocaine, an antiarrhythmic medication, in a brief but intensive killing spree that ended only when a suspicious physician demanded investigation of the extraordinary death rate on his unit. Born in 1943 in Los Angeles, Robert Diaz presented himself as a dedicated and experienced nurse with 17 years of hospital employment, though his career had been marked by numerous dismissals for incompetence, medication errors, and erratic behavior that somehow never resulted in reported sanctions or prevented his continued employment in acute care settings. Diaz began working at Community Hospital of the Valleys, a small 86-bed facility in Riverside County, in early 1981, quickly establishing himself on the graveyard shift of the intensive care unit, a position that gave him access to critically ill patients and powerful cardiac medications including lignocaine, which he would use as his murder weapon over the subsequent 6 months. His killing spree began in earnest in March 1981, with elderly cardiac patients suddenly suffering fatal arrhythmias during Diaz's shifts, deaths that initially appeared consistent with their underlying conditions until the frequency became statistically impossible to ignore, with 12 patients dying specifically during Diaz's care in a hospital that had previously averaged approximately 1 death per month on the same unit. Diaz's method involved injecting massive overdoses of lignocaine directly into patients' intravenous lines, causing rapid cardiac collapse that overwhelmed the body's electrical conduction system and produced fatal arrhythmias, deaths that appeared natural to attending physicians who were not present during the collapses and relied on Diaz's reports of events. The critical intervention came from Dr. James Music, a cardiologist who noticed that his patients were dying with unusual frequency specifically when Diaz was their nurse, and who demanded that hospital administrators investigate the pattern, going so far as to threaten to withdraw from the medical staff if his concerns were not addressed. Hospital administrators, reluctant to confront a difficult situation, initially resisted action but eventually conducted an internal review in July 1981 that confirmed Diaz's presence at all 12 suspicious deaths and his access to lignocaine in amounts inconsistent with legitimate patient care, leading to his dismissal on July 29, 1981, and subsequent reporting to the California Board of Registered Nursing. The board's investigation was woefully inadequate, consisting primarily of a brief interview with Diaz in which he denied wrongdoing, followed by a decision to take no action beyond continuing monitoring, a failure that allowed Diaz to obtain employment at San Bernardino County Medical Center, where he continued working until his eventual arrest. The breakthrough came when Riverside County Sheriff's Department investigators, alerted by persistent complaints from Dr. Music and hospital staff, began a formal criminal investigation in late 1981, obtaining exhumation orders for multiple victims and discovering lignocaine levels far exceeding therapeutic ranges in tissues analyzed by forensic toxicologists at the FBI laboratory. Diaz was arrested on August 11, 1981, and charged with 12 counts of first-degree murder, with prosecutors building a case based on statistical improbability, opportunity, and forensic evidence of lignocaine overdose in 6 of the 12 victims whose remains provided testable tissue samples. His trial began in March 1982 at Riverside County Superior Court, with the prosecution presenting extensive evidence of the statistical impossibility of natural deaths, occurring so frequently during Diaz's shifts, toxicological analysis demonstrating lethal lignocaine levels, and testimony from colleagues regarding Diaz's unusual behavior, including his apparent excitement during patient emergencies and his inconsistent explanations for medication administration. The defense argued that the deaths were natural consequences of cardiac disease, that the toxicological analysis was unreliable given tissue decomposition, and that the prosecution was attempting to explain medical misfortune through conspiracy theory, but the evidence proved overwhelming. The jury convicted Diaz on all 12 counts of first-degree murder on April 5, 1982, and he was sentenced to death, with the judge describing his crimes as heinous, atrocious, and cruel, and finding no mitigating circumstances sufficient to justify less than the maximum penalty. Diaz spent over 30 years on California's death row at San Quentin State Prison, exhausting all direct appeals and habeas corpus petitions while maintaining his innocence and attributing the deaths to natural causes and medical incompetence in his prosecution, until he died of natural causes on August 23, 2010, at the age of 67, cheating execution by approximately 3 decades of appellate litigation. The Diaz case, occurring contemporaneously with similar scandals at other California hospitals, contributed to significant reforms in nursing oversight and medication security. Though critics noted that the California Board of Registered Nursing's initial failure to act on early warnings represented a systemic problem of professional self-regulation that persists in many jurisdictions. Number 8. Efren Saldivar, the respiratory therapist who murdered at least 6 patients and possibly as many as 50 to 100 others at Glendale Adventist Medical Center in California, using powerful paralytic drugs to induce respiratory arrest in a pattern that continued for 8 years despite multiple colleagues expressing concerns about his proximity to patient deaths. Born in 1969 in Brownsville, Texas, Efren Saldivar moved to California as a child and pursued respiratory therapy, completing his training and obtaining licensure in 1990, beginning employment at Glendale Adventist Medical Center that same year in the respiratory care department, where he would work until his eventual arrest in 1998. Glendale Adventist was a 515-bed hospital serving the diverse Los Angeles suburb, with Saldivar working primarily night shifts when staffing was reduced and supervision minimal. Ideal conditions for the murder method he developed involving Pavilon and succinylcholine, powerful neuromuscular blocking agents that cause complete paralysis including respiratory arrest, producing death by asphyxiation that appears consistent with respiratory failure in critically ill patients. Saldivar's crimes began in 1990, possibly even during his training period, and continued with remarkable consistency for 8 years, with victims primarily being elderly or critically ill patients who were expected to die and whose sudden respiratory arrests attracted little suspicion from physicians focused on underlying disease processes rather than deliberate intervention. His pattern involved entering patient rooms on pretext of routine respiratory care, injecting paralytic drugs into intravenous lines, then departing before the drugs took effect, with the subsequent collapse occurring minutes later when Saldivar would often be called to assist with intubation attempts, positioning himself to observe the results of his actions while appearing to provide legitimate medical care. Concerns about Saldivar began emerging as early as 1992, with nurses and physicians noting his unusual proximity to patient deaths and his apparent ability to predict which patients would experience respiratory emergencies. Yet these concerns were consistently dismissed by hospital administrators who attributed the pattern to coincidence and seemed more concerned with protecting the institution from liability than investigating potential criminal behavior. In 1996, 3 respiratory therapists, Aurelia Mora, David Namba, and Glenn Robbins, submitted formal written complaints to hospital administration detailing their suspicions about Saldivar, including specific incidents where they believed he had harmed patients and statistical analysis showing his presence at an extraordinary number of deaths. Yet the hospital conducted only a cursory internal review and allowed Saldivar to continue working with minimal supervision. The critical break came in January 1998 when Saldivar himself, during a job interview at another hospital, mentioned in passing that he had put patients out of their misery at Glendale Adventist, a statement that the interviewing manager reported to Glendale police, finally triggering the comprehensive investigation that should have occurred years earlier. Police investigators, working with the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Office, obtained exhumation orders for 20 patients and discovered detectable levels of pavulon in tissue samples from 6 victims, with the drug's presence being definitive proof of homicide as it is never administered for therapeutic purposes outside controlled anesthesia settings. Saldivar was arrested on March 31, 1998, and initially denied all allegations, but confronted with the forensic evidence and the statements he had made during his job interview, he eventually confessed to murdering 6 patients and suggested the true number might be between 50 and 100 victims over his 8-year career, though he was unable to provide specific details for most of these additional deaths. The confession created immediate controversy as defense attorneys argued it was coerced and unreliable, while prosecutors faced the challenge of building cases for additional murders without forensic evidence given tissue degradation and cremation of most potential victims. Saldivar was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder and pleaded guilty to all charges in January 2002, in an agreement that spared him the death penalty in exchange for his cooperation in identifying additional victims and testifying about hospital protocols that had enabled his crimes, receiving 6 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. The Saldivar case generated enormous controversy regarding institutional accountability, with multiple lawsuits filed by families of victims alleging that Glendale Adventist administrators had known of the danger and failed to act, resulting in substantial confidential settlements and significant damage to the hospital's reputation. The case also prompted California legislative reforms requiring mandatory reporting of healthcare workers suspected of harming patients and improved whistleblower protections for employees who raised safety concerns. Though critics noted that the existing complaints about Saldivar had been ignored despite clear protocols that should have triggered immediate action, Saldivar remains incarcerated at California State Prison, Corcoran, having exhausted all appeals and maintained a low profile in prison, his case representing one of the most egregious examples of institutional failure to protect patients from a known threat within the healthcare system. Number 9. Elizabeth Wettlaufer, the Canadian registered nurse who murdered 8 elderly patients and attempted to murder 6 others with insulin injections over a decade in Ontario long-term care facilities, whose case exposed critical failures in nursing regulation and hospital oversight that allowed her to continue practicing despite multiple incidents of professional misconduct and mental health crises. Born in 1967 in Toronto, Elizabeth Louise Wettlaufer struggled throughout her life with substance abuse, mental illness, and professional incompetence that somehow never resulted in permanent removal from nursing despite numerous red flags that should have prevented her continued access to vulnerable patients. Wettlaufer graduated from nursing school in 1995 and obtained registration with the College of Nurses of Ontario, beginning her career in long-term care settings where elderly patients with diabetes provided ideal targets for her eventual murder method using insulin, a drug she could access legitimately for therapeutic purposes and administer without immediate suspicion given the prevalence of diabetes in her patient population. Her killing spree began in 2007 at Care Nursing and Retirement Home in Woodstock, Ontario, where she murdered 7 patients over 7 years using insulin overdoses that induced fatal hypoglycemia, deaths that were routinely attributed to natural causes in elderly diabetics without thorough investigation or toxicological analysis. Wettlaufer's victims ranged in age from 75 to 96, all residents of long-term care facilities where she worked as a registered nurse, with murders occurring intermittently rather than continuously, suggesting a pattern triggered by personal stress and psychological decompensation rather than consistent compulsive behavior. Her professional record during this period was marked by numerous incidents of incompetence, medication errors, and erratic behavior, including one episode where she was found incoherent and impaired at work. Yet the College of Nurses of Ontario consistently responded with remedial education and monitoring rather than suspension or revocation of her license, enabling her continued access to victims. In 2014, Wettlaufer was fired from Care for medication errors unrelated to her murders, subsequently obtaining employment at Meadowpark Long-Term Care in London, Ontario, where she murdered an 8th patient, 75-year-old Arpad Horvath, in August 2016, before being fired again for professional incompetence. Following this final dismissal, Wettlaufer experienced a severe psychological crisis, checking herself into a psychiatric facility in September 2016 and confessing to multiple murders to a therapist and later to police, providing detailed information about her methods, motivations, and victims that allowed investigators to identify the full scope of her crimes. The subsequent investigation revealed that some of Wettlaufer's earlier murders had actually been investigated as potential homicides at the time, with one victim's body exhumed in 2011 and tissue samples preserved that showed evidence of insulin overdose. Yet the investigation was inexplicably closed without resolution and Wettlaufer was never identified as a suspect despite being the primary nurse for all victims. Wettlaufer was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of aggravated assault, with prosecutors building a case based on her detailed confessions, forensic evidence from exhumed bodies, and pattern analysis showing her presence at all deaths and her access to insulin administration for all victims. Her trial began in January 2017 at Ontario Superior Court of Justice in Woodstock, with Wettlaufer pleading guilty to all charges before evidence was presented, eliminating the need for trial but requiring a sentencing hearing where the Crown presented extensive evidence of her crimes and the systemic failures that enabled them. On June 26, 2017, Wettlaufer was sentenced to 8 concurrent life terms with no eligibility for parole for 25 years, plus additional sentences for attempted murders, ensuring she will remain incarcerated until at least 2041 when she would be 74 years old. The Wettlaufer case prompted massive reform in Ontario's healthcare regulatory system, including the Long-Term Care Homes and Retirement Homes Act amendments strengthening oversight of nurses with disciplinary histories, mandatory reporting of medication errors, and improved coordination between healthcare employers and regulatory colleges. Though critics argued these reforms addressed symptoms rather than root causes of a regulatory culture that prioritized professional rehabilitation over patient protection. Wettlaufer is currently incarcerated at Grand Valley Institution for Women in Kitchener, Ontario, having exhausted appeals and becoming eligible for parole in 2041. Her case remaining a focal point for debates about mental illness, professional regulation, and the vulnerability of elderly patients in institutional care settings. Number 10. William Davis, the Texas nurse who murdered at least 4 patients and attempted to murder 11 others with heart-stopping injections at hospitals across East Texas, whose case revealed how a nurse with a record of professional failure could move between facilities, continuing to murder despite multiple employers having concerns about his competence and character. Born in 1989 in Hallsville, Texas, William George Davis pursued nursing after military service, graduating from Tyler Junior College in 2013 and obtaining registered nurse licensure in Texas, beginning his nursing career at a series of small East Texas hospitals where his professional difficulties and eventual murder spree would unfold over 4 years. Davis's employment history revealed a pattern of professional failure that somehow never triggered permanent removal from nursing. He was fired from East Texas Medical Center in Tyler in 2013 for performance issues, then from Mother Frances Hospital in Tyler in 2014 for dosing errors and falsification of records, yet he was able to obtain subsequent employment at Christus Mother Frances Hospital in Jacksonville, and eventually at Christus Trinity Mother Frances Hospital in Tyler, where his murder spree would finally be discovered. His killing method involved injecting air into patients' arterial lines or injecting other substances that would cause sudden cardiac or neurological events, techniques designed to mimic natural medical complications in patients already hospitalized with serious conditions, with victims primarily being post-surgical or cardiac patients whose sudden deteriorations would be attributed to their underlying diseases. Davis's crimes began in earnest in 2017 at Christus Trinity Mother Frances Hospital, with victims including 47-year-old Christopher Greenaway, 61-year-old Ronald Clark, 82-year-old John Lafferty, and 58-year-old Perry Franklin. All patients who had been recovering from surgery or cardiac procedures when they suffered sudden fatal events during Davis's shifts, deaths that initially appeared as unfortunate medical complications rather than deliberate murder. The pattern of suspicious events during Davis's shifts became apparent to some colleagues, with nurses noting his unusual interest in patients who were not assigned to his care and his presence at numerous code blue emergencies. Yet these concerns were initially addressed through counseling and shift changes rather than serious investigation or reporting to regulatory authorities. The critical breakthrough came in January 2018 when forensic analysis of John Lafferty's death revealed evidence of an air embolism inconsistent with natural causes, prompting a comprehensive review of all deaths during Davis's shifts that identified a clear pattern of deliberate harm, leading to his suspension and subsequent termination in February 2018. Following his dismissal, Davis was actually able to obtain employment at another East Texas hospital, Athens Regional Medical Center, where he worked for several months before his nursing license was finally suspended in August 2018 based on the ongoing criminal investigation, demonstrating the critical failures in information sharing and regulatory oversight that allowed a suspected serial killer to continue accessing patients. Davis was arrested in April 2018 and charged with multiple counts of capital murder, with prosecutors building an extensive case based on forensic evidence, pattern analysis, and testimony from colleagues regarding his unusual behavior and proximity to deaths, while defense attorneys argued that the deaths were natural and the prosecution was manufacturing a case through hindsight bias and flawed statistical analysis. His trial began in October 2021 at Smith County District Court in Tyler, Texas, lasting nearly a month as the prosecution presented detailed evidence of deliberate harm, including forensic confirmation of air embolism in multiple victims, while the defense emphasized the absence of eyewitnesses and the natural fragility of the patient population. The jury convicted Davis of capital murder on October 19, 2021, finding him guilty of murdering John Lafferty, and subsequently sentenced him to death on October 27, 2021, rejecting defense arguments of mitigating circumstances including alleged mental health issues and personality disorders. The Davis case highlighted persistent failures in nursing regulatory systems that allow nurses with histories of professional failure to move between employers without comprehensive background checks or mandatory reporting of termination circumstances, with Texas and other states subsequently strengthening requirements for employment verification and regulatory notification when nurses are dismissed for competence or conduct issues. Davis remains on death row at the Allen B. Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, awaiting execution while pursuing appeals that challenge the sufficiency of evidence and the fairness of his trial. His case representing the most recent major American medical murder prosecution and a continuing reminder of the vulnerability of hospitalized patients to deliberate harm by those entrusted with their care.